Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Jubi Arriola-Headley presenting his debut poetry collection, Original Kink, in conversation with Allison Adair. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these unprecedented times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have any questions for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Original Kink on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help to ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these past few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now, I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Jubi Arriola-Headley is a Black queer poet and storyteller. He's a 2018 PEN America Emerging Voices Fellow, and his poems have been published in numerous outlets, including Ambit, Beloit Poetry Journal, and the Southeastern Humanities Review, among many others. Tonight, he will be joined by poet Allison Adair, whose debut poetry collection, The Clearing, is the winner of the 2020 Max Ritvo Poetry Prize. These two will be discussing Jubi's debut collection, Original Kink, which Chamondale award-winning poet Malika Booker said interrogates masculinity, family dynamics, and state executions of Black bodies with unflinching tenderness and a relentless compulsion to expose tyrannies, both self-inflicted and externally imposed. It harnesses bruising, vulnerable language with biblical cadence, narrative precision, and a musical dexterity to create a poetic of witness of hymns, striving to demonstrate that this is how tyrannies are built, like lullabies. We're so happy to have them here tonight to discuss this collection. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Jubi and Allison.
Thank you. Thank you. Allison, I know you're probably going to be asking most of the questions tonight, but considering what day and week and month and year this is, why don't we do a quick check-in? How are you doing?
I am doing fine. Thank you for asking. I know we've been talking about this, and being from central Pennsylvania, I've been watching the map pretty closely from my old blue state of Massachusetts, but watching the people at home. And I want to sort of check in and see how you're doing too before we hear some poems.
I am from Boston originally, born and raised, but now I live in South Florida, and I'm of many minds. I, like I've said to you, have kind of taken a self-care moment and mostly tuned out and mostly taken a position that no matter what happens, I'm going to need to survive and continue to move through the world in this body. So I have not divested so much as tried to find a moment of peace and equanimity to exist. Even while people disparage Florida, and I get a little bit of that, but I also think, you know, Florida is made up of many people, and sure, a slight majority of Floridians have chosen, or rather made a choice that I'm not happy with or comfortable with, that I'm scared of, quite honestly, but just under 50% of them did not. So I want people, as they're looking around the country and thinking how communities vote and don't vote, to remember that in every place, there are probably folks who think like you do. So something to keep in mind, I guess.
Yeah, I was saying earlier that when you think about it, every swath on the map is ultimately a purple county. A different shade of purple. So it's going to take the work and support of those people who are trying to make sure that voices are heard and changes made. Yeah. But one of the things I found surprisingly timely, though I anticipated that your beautiful book, and if people haven't seen the cover, obviously, I anticipated that there would be a lot of urgency to the book. And I know it's been written fairly recently. So I anticipated that one of the things I found that was so timely in terms of the book was not just its exploration of intensity and hardship, et cetera, but also the ways in which it offers practiced refrains for survival. And so I was actually hoping that you might be willing to begin with one of those poems that offers a path, a way, a method. And so, you know, I had some marked down, for example, maybe Prayer for Grown Folks, or one of the ones that you might choose.
I'm good with Prayer for Grown Folks. And it's interesting that I think it's interesting that you picked that one, because in my mind, that poem is incomplete in the sense that it ends in the middle of a thought or a feeling, which is an intentional move on my part. But that says something about, I think, where we are. And as you're alluding to, this is sort of an ongoing process. But anyway, let me read this poem to you. This poem is called Prayer for Grown Folks. That blood keeps sewering through my veins like rats in New York, invincible. That my thickening thighs don't sprout tender shoots of varicose veins. That I'll always be blindsided by that burst of fuchsia in the throats of children and the hidden folds of a lover. That I find the grace to meet the officer's glare without Crenshaw in my eyes and catfish on my tongue. That the sight of two men holding hands in these soiled streets becomes familiar to me like my morning piss or school shootings. That I learn how to walk in the world without scanning for my silhouette rendered in chalk and framed in caution tape. That I'll know whether it's better to die after everyone I love or before. That I be not forgotten till after I'm gone. That's that poem.
Thank you. I do. I think there's something about the sustained tension of the incompleteness at the end that is a method of survival, that feels like, you know, what Keats talked about as negative capability, like being able to sort of hang out, you know, in that space and sort of carry it.
Exactly. It's a constant unknowing, if that makes any sense, and sort of, like you're saying, having to balance that tension. I mean, that's life in general, but that is a specific tension that exists for certain bodies in this moment, in this state. And that's kind of a lot of what I try to do in my poetry, and I'm sure I'm not unique in this, is balance many competing tensions, whether that's rage and joy, or knowing and unknowing, or longing or fulfillment. You know, Whitman said it, we contain multitudes. So I'm never really hoping my poem will do one thing. I'm hoping it might do many things. And like I think you alluded to in some notes you sent me, or in a question, you know, thinking through whether or not that's honest duplicity. I think it is. I'm not vested in what resonates with you. I'm vested that I give you the options. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I sort of think about it.
It does. And I had put that question to you, which is a question I consider all the time too, which is how to allow a poem to progress and advance towards some landing spot if the answer is often a tension. And so I put that question to you, and maybe I'll sort of jump to that one, spinning off of your poem Eulogy in the book. But it applies to many of your poems, how you go about writing poems about sustained tension, the relationship between joy and rage, for example, or fear and attraction and things like that. Are there any poems that jump to your mind when we talk about this sustained tension that you would like to read?
Oh, that I would like to read? You know, it's funny because the second poem in the book, actually most of the poems I feel like do this. Eulogy, in a certain way, does that. Eulogy was literally, it's funny, I had the idea to do it, before I came across Etheridge Knight's poem Haiku, which that poem epigraphs. But once I heard that, that epigraph, I had to sort of write that poem that way. But I think the intention in that poem is about eulogizing somebody who's still alive, about feeling the need. And lots of poets have dealt with this. I think about Jericho Brown, I think about other poets, walking through the world as a Black man, knowing what the world thinks of you, knowing how the world tries to thug and criminal and predator you. It's a literal tension as well as a figurative tension that we carry in our bodies. So knowing that you have to think about this in immediate ways puts you in a certain frame of mind. So there's a little bit of braggadocio in this poem, or a lot of braggadocio, quite honestly, and a lot of eulogies are that, but there's also sort of that coming down from the storytelling through jazz and the 70s and the last poets and rap tradition of sort of singing your own praises, because who else might get the chance to? And so there's that tension of trying to sing your own praises and acknowledging that at any moment you could be taken away. And I think 11, which is the poem after that, actually does that as well. That's kind of trying to be a contrapuntal poem, from the musical term. And you have one in your book too, I believe. Sort of the notion is that you have two, in theory at least, disparate conversations that somehow meld and mesh to form a third distinct maybe dialogue. And I'm not sure that 11 accomplishes that. 11, for those of you who haven't bought the book yet, 11 is about Stephon Clark, who is one of a litany of names that we could list of Black men who have been murdered by the police. He lived in, I believe, Oakland, and he was met in his backyard in the dark by two policemen who, within 11 seconds of having first called out his name, had shot him 20 times. So that's what that poem's about. But what the poem tries to do is invest him with a humanity by sort of thinking through what his final thoughts might have been, if there's any truth to that. When one has happened upon the moment of their death, their life flashes through their eyes. What is he thinking? I find a lot of the conversation around these folks who have died in the past several years, at least, has been about what their failings are, or what they might, and this is a very external conversation. Those conversations often happen about what might have happened in their lives that led them to a moment where they would be in a position to be shot. And I feel like that divests these folks of their humanity. And I'm not the only one who feels this way, but it does. It divests them of their humanity. So what, in the few times I've tried to write these poems, I try to do is reposition the point of view and come at it from their point of view. There's another poem in the book that's not about a single moment. It's called Pulse, and it's about the Pulse shooting. And again, that's written from the point of view of some young queer kids in a club experiencing moments of joy before what happens to them, which is not the sum of their lives or the definition of their lives, but a point in their lives. So I don't know if that, I think that makes sense, sort of trying to reinvest these folks with their humanity that gets taken away from them in the way some of these stories get articulated in the media and on social media.
One of the things that's true about 11 and a few of your other poems is that you use repetition. And I know this is something that you mentioned you saw in my poems too, something I play with. Repetition and reconfiguration as a means of suggesting multiple stories. When before you were talking about Stephon Clark, you mentioned you want to tell certain people's point of view, but an individual too has multiple points of view.
Yeah.
Poet has multiple points of view. The first person I in a poem has multiple points of view. And so that's one of the things I found sort of remarkable in 11 and other poems, which is this idea of like doling out the cards and then shuffling them and doling them out in a new way in order to create an additional competing story or an additional story, like different ways of looking at the same story, and the same life and the same person, and how as long as you're alive, that can be, you know, reconfigured and reanimated. And then one of the elegies that occurs consistently in one of the laments that occurs consistently in the book is what happens when that stops short. And you know, how hard it is to wrangle that and manage that after someone has been taken.
Exactly.
I thought maybe in terms of getting to a specific poem, I would go back a second and just talk for a second about how we met, which is that we both sort of entered a contest from the Southern Humanities Review. And once the finalists came out, I saw your poem Transubstantiation and felt it's a very short poem. I'm hoping that you'll read it for us in a second. It felt so rich and familiar, but fresh. And just to sort of mention to other people, I wrote you a fan note and I said, I think this is such a beautiful poem.
My first fan note, by the way.
Oh, well, not your last, I'm sure. But I feel so happy that I wrote you and that it has brought us, you know, to a correspondence of poems, etc. So I'm hoping you would read it and also maybe use it to tell us a little bit about the book project and what made you want to do this, the book in general.
Okay. Let me read the poem and then go back and tell you a little bit about the poem and then let that broaden into a conversation about the book. Maybe that way? Okay. This poem is called Transubstantiation, and it has an epigraph, which was a statement I heard in a conversation, a panel discussion in 2019 by the well-regarded and stellar poet Don Lundy Martin. And what she said was, Blackness is innovation on a received form. The nerve of you to think you could vesper hog's hooves into feast, that hymns could be coaxed into hip hop, that wool would kink and rope and lock into something resembling God, that you could stand the lash or the late shift without wilting. Spirit legacy from the spaces between the words, speak in a voice that booms, not breaks. Hope. Fix your face to smile like your teeth wasn't butter yellow. Be better than bitter. Be roiling in joy. Be. So the poem was born literally because I attended a conversation with Don Lundy Martin was there, and so was Evie Shockley and a couple of other poets, Black women poets, and they were having a conversation about Blackness and poetry very broadly. I'm sure it was much more specific, but I will tell you, there are things that you know are intuitively true and that you realize is information you carry with you, either historically or through experience, you just know are true. But when Don Lundy Martin said in the context of that conversation, Blackness is innovation on a received form, it like sort of blew the rest of the conversation out of the water. I remember none of it. I was stuck on that. And for weeks, that phrase would just pop into my head at all sorts of moments. And I wrestled with it, and it insisted on staying there. And one morning I woke up and this poem happened out of it because it needed to, because that's the only way I could get that phrase out of my head and move on with my life. And that's kind of a mirror process to how the book was born. I don't know, I've had conversations with other poets, and I know sometimes what happens is that folks write a lot of poems and they recognize, because they're a whole person and a complete individual, poems relate and have themes, and they weave them into a narrative and create a collection. That's not what happened for me. I woke up, and I can go into the backstory of how I came to writing if that makes sense, but I woke up one day about 6 years ago, maybe 7, and said, I need to write a book about my father. And that felt like a fact, not a belief or not a desire. And when I say that, I mean, it felt like if I didn't write the book, something bad was going to happen to me. Like I would start to waste away. Like I had to write that book in order to continue, and not in continue in any way, to continue. Like I had to make it a point in my life to write that book. And so I initially thought I was going to write it as nonfiction, and I tried and it wouldn't sing. And I had had some experience with poetry, but I am not the person who can give you the story that I've been writing poetry since I was 8 years old. I wasn't. I did a little writing in high school and had an experience in college. And this probably is a story for many would-be writers out there, where I got some good feedback and then I got some not good feedback, and I thought, oh, well, this wasn't meant for me. So I found other ways to channel writing. I focused on journalism more and ghostwriting for folks more and writing poetically memos. But when I decided I had to write this book, I'm like, I don't know how to write a book. So I started taking classes in about 2013, 2014, just everywhere I could outside of work time. And some of those classes, because somebody suggested this, were poetry classes, and I fell in love. And I am sure the first 10 or 20 or 200 poems I wrote were utter shit, but people were generous. It didn't say stop. They said continue, just keep going. And so I got introduced not only to writing poetry, but to reading poetry. And maybe it happened at the time it needed to. I always feel like I wasn't mature enough in college and maybe many years after to get poetry. I always felt like I didn't, like there was something obscured for me. And by the time this happened about 7 years ago, it didn't feel that way anymore. I approached poetry with completely different lens, and it resonated broadly. And so it became the vessel, or it became the means, the tools through which I would write this book about my father. But that's where it was born. I will say this, once I started writing the book, I figured out that multiple things can be true at the same time. There's a way in which this book is about my father. And that's where it started. I felt like I had to write a book about my father. And it was going to be a contentious book because we didn't have the best relationship. But one of the things you discover as a writer is you've got to tell the truth. And the truth is nobody is all one thing. So I had to find the moments of tenderness with my father. And then when you read poems like Daddy or Hustle, you see that some of those moments escaped. Some of those were near misses, but they were still there. So I had to discover that. And poetry is a unique tool to be able to do that. I'm sure you can do it in fiction and nonfiction too, but I almost feel like poetry, if it's going to resonate, absolutely requires that. I don't know that other genres require that as much. So it became bigger than just about my father. It became about how I see tenderness and masculinity, and a conversation that needs to happen not only among Black men, but in the broader Black community with Black women as well. And so there's a very real and true sense in which I want anybody who wants to take the time to read this book to read it. But in my mind, it's a wrestling for Black men and a conversation or dialogue with Black women. That's sort of the cornerstone of what I was trying to do.
And I'm wondering if, I know we talked about this before, I think one of the things that the book does so interestingly, and again, we keep using the word tender, but I think it's the right one, so tenderly, is to find itself intersecting with Black womanhood and Black femininity and motherhood, for example. I wondered if you would be willing to read Hot Comb.
Hot Comb, sure. It's funny because if you ask, somebody once asked me sometime, you know how it is, you get a new book out and people start asking you questions about the book. One of the fascinating things about this is it sort of requires you to think about how to talk about your own work, which isn't something I was really vested in when I was writing, but now is necessary, obviously. I say all this to say, somebody asked me what was the hardest poem to write, and I have a couple of answers to that, but there was a way in which this was the hardest poem to write, because this is a reaching for something. This is a gesture toward trying to see in a meaningful way Black women, Black womanhood, Black girlhood, And Black women will tell me if it succeeds or not. But I feel very protective of, and at the same time, very nervous about this poem because it's doing something that I feel is some of my most important work. And I want it to at least be perceived as genuine. It might fail at what I'm hoping it does, which is okay, but I want it to be seen at least as genuine. Anyway, so much for being vested in one's own work. Let me read this poem. It is called Hot Comb. So much of who we are is birthed of ritual, and this, the holiest, a mystery to you, how calloused hands can minister such tenderness. Put you a minute in the kitchen, tuck your seat, neat in the corner so you won't miss a thing. Smell that scorch, that singe of stovetop on brass tines, so hot they hum like some torqued up tuning fork. Watch those hands soothe grease along root's edge, thick, an anointing, a blessing, a psalm. Steal from this moment secrets no boy could ever know, that you've not got what it takes to woman your way through the dust of the day, that every bomb's not for the benefit of the burn, that so much of mothering is slinging gossamer over the sear of this world, that this too is a cost, that there's always a cost. And here, near the end of it, so close, you thought, to clasping the key in your own artless grasp, learn that you can't unlearn every secret, least the one most locked to you, how much it hurts to be a girl.
Thank you. Last weekend, I participated in a reading for Borderlands with a few other poets. Borderlands, the Texas Poetry Review.
Okay.
And one of the poets who read was Taylor Bias, B-Y-A-S, the poet. She a poem that was published in the issue about, she just was posting about it on Twitter today. So if anyone is interested, they can go. But she read a beautiful poem and I think that she gestured toward it being autobiographical, but just for the sake of honoring the I we create in our poems, in the poem, the speaker is talking about a younger brother who has gotten old enough to have been alienated bodily from the older sister. You know, there isn't that kind of like grab you and take you in, and the speaker is aware of this physical distance between herself and her brother who's going through stuff, and ultimately sort of seizes that closeness. One of the things that I think about in my book, and when you were just talking about how once you put the poems out in the world or the book out in the world, you then have to kind of read them through everyone else's eyes. One of the things that occurred to me when I was sequencing my book is how I have a lot of poems about violence against women. I have a lot of poems about motherhood. I have a lot of poems about romantic encounters and sexuality. And how to sequence those without making people uncomfortable was something that I worried about until I stopped worrying about it. Because I started thinking, these things all intersect with each other. You know, a concern about violence, a lot of it has to do with the body. One of the things that I think is interesting in your book is that a poem like Hot Comb, which does relate a lot toward closeness and the closeness between family that comes from a physical state and a physical closeness, that those poems rub up against the poems about sexuality and romantic sexuality outside of the family. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the body and how you render and engage the body in your poems, and maybe read to us one of the poems that's meaningful to you in terms of a kind of meaningful engagement with sexuality and just the physicality of some of the topics that come up in your poems.
Huh. I feel like that's an SAT question or just.
Oh no, I didn't mean that.
Oh no. I will do my best to honor it and answer it. You know, it's interesting you talk about sequencing and sort of this, how poems match together, because I had sort of challenges trying to sequence too. initially I was taking a lot of external opinions, and then I realized I had to do what made logical sense to me. And I don't live life as, a Black man here and a queer man there and a man over 40 there. I am all things at once. So it didn't make sense to me to do those kinds of divisions. All of this is swirling around in my head all the time. I am a happy person who is in a happy relationship, who has wonderful friends and a collection of poems out. So there's a lot of joy in my life, but also I have a lot of rage because there's not universal health care, and Black folks keep getting killed. Black trans people keep getting killed, and people keep trying to take away queer folks' rights and silence Black women. So we hold all these things in ourselves all the time. And so what began to make sense to me in terms of sequencing was kind of telling the story and it's kind of that unfinished process we started talking about. This to me is a series of retellings. I have a prologue poem and an epilogue poem, but in between there are 3 sections in the book. And to me, they're sort of 3 looks at tenderness and masculinity and rage and joy and all of that. But sort of the first section is how it was handed down to me, who I think my father tried to get me to be, and what kinds of issues ensued when I tried to reckon with that. And then there was the middle section where I tried again. It was another failed sort of retelling. Failure in the most positive sense, by the way, not failure as in any negative sense from a judgmental perspective. Failure as in, I think life is a series of failures. We keep trying. That is the human experience. So the first section is me trying to be the man my father wanted me to be. The second section is me not knowing what man I needed to be in those early years of adulthood, trying to figure out what that's supposed to be. And then the third section is me sort of looking back at my life and thinking, what experiences are most meaningful to you in developing who you would like to be? So that's kind of how I structured it. And that's kind of how I think about how I write poetry. It's how I think about life. It's how I think probably about the body. We hold all of these things in ourselves. One of the reasons that the title, Original Kink, resonated with me is because I think kink as a word has a lot of associations. There's absolutely a sexual connotation with kink. And I mean for that to be there. I'm a Black queer man, and I'm a Black queer man who loves in a certain way and has sex in a certain way. And yes, I'm kind of putting that out there for you to have to deal with, because why not? But there's also kink in terms of hair, which has so many loaded connotations for Black folks. And then there's kink in terms of nuts, which is in terms of ropes, which is in terms of binding, which again has some more than one, many connotations, and some of them about bondage as Black folks, and some of them as bondage in other ways. So I wanted folks to have to wrestle with all of that. And I think when I think about the body, what I usually try to do is just honor it and try to think of it in a holistic sense, which maybe sounds like, I'm writing a self-help book, but that's not what I mean to do. I don't know why I'm called, I think right now, to read this poem, and maybe it's not the poem that speaks to this the most, but a lot of what I try to do in my poetry is capture a rhythm. And that's because my experience, at least in this body, in my culture, in my community, is that there's a lot of rhythm. I find that music and dance, I was listening to a song earlier, and I can't even remember the name of it now because I just heard it, but it was sort of a call to action. It was a very political song written, I can remember this much, written by a young man named Rick Wilson who lives in Chicago, and it was mostly rapped. But the point is, somehow this song was a call to action and a rejection of external principles, very political, very Black Lives Matter, but way, way more than that. But the point is, it was set to a banging dance beat. And that's a definition of Blackness to me, a definition of queerness. We can hold, that's like rage and joy balanced. We can hold these truths to be self-evident. We can demand more, and we can do it to a two-step. And I say all that because that makes me want to read Pulse. So that's the poem I'm going to read. And hopefully folks will like it. So anyway, this is Pulse. But tonight, all we can pray for is dance to mommy and papi and boo and baby our bodies into hungering arms, hips overflowing with jukebox and bassline, where jerk and twerk and pose and grind are street names for genuflection, where we dwell in the valley of call and response. We sing in shaman's terms, I see the God in you. Rage toward crescendo and lockstep, sweat like worship is labor. Find freedom in our faith, in this beat, this praise song. Too soon we come to end of anthem, our burden now to steal our souls. Fingers linger, stealth down your chest, press flesh where bullets soon enter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any chance you'll be willing to read A Modest Proposal?
Sure, that's a different one. You know,
I love A Modest Proposal. I don't know what the backstory is, but I loved it. I felt like it was a real, as a friend of mine says, an open hand in this poem, where it kind of said yes to all its different elements.
I love that. Thank you. I was at a residency last year, and if anybody is a writer out there and they have a chance to apply for a residency at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, do it. It's 3 weeks with a master artist where you partially work with that artist on their project, but you also get time to work on your own project. And I was there, and the poet I got to work with, among a group of associate poets who were wonderful and I still keep in contact with, but the poet was Cornelius Eady, who I love. That's just the background. What really happened was there was a poet there named Travis Craig, who's pretty musical as well. So he was always playing with his guitar or making up beats. And one day our prompt, because Cornelius himself is also very musical and writes a lot of songs and has a band, and in fact performed while he was there. One day, one of Travis's beats that he laid down was a track, and that was our prompt to write poetry to for the next day. And I played it over and over. It just kind of repeated on the loop, and it just put me in a mood. And what came to me actually were the words mirror me, which was my translation of marry me. And it felt like a proposal. It felt like this was the music you would set a gorgeous kind of film I would like to see proposal to. So I wrote that poem. So this is called A Modest Proposal, which also plays with the title from Jonathan Swift very, very deliberately. Drown me in the thick of your joyful poise. Drag me across the sun-soaked surface of impossible kick. Cloak me in a myth of watershed memories. Wash a dish every now and when. Thrust me toward ineffable cliffhanger faith. Race me to this inescapable reincarnation. Let's hope we come back bugs. Sing me under the table with limerick. Tease me out of my miserable busy. Spray after you flush for sanity's sake. And maybe before. Let me hold you till the moment past apocalypse. Say yes.
I love how that say yes at the end becomes, of course, an imperative, but also the biggest question, the biggest moment of uncertainty in the poem.
Exactly. That's a longing. I mean, for that to be that's like, you know, that's almost begging. That's almost like, you know, those 60s crooners. on their knees. That's Al Green on his knees on stage with that note begging. That's what that moment is in my mind. And
by the way,
that resonated with you because I almost didn't include this in the collection. I wasn't sure.
That's funny. That happened to me too. In one of the early reviews of my book, the something that someone called out in a positive way was the one poem I was most anxious about, and 5 times, but you never know. So
right?
we have not a ton of time left before the Q&A, but I thought we could do one more question and maybe a poem, and then move into the kind of final poems we had talked about before we do the Q&A. So if it's okay with you, I wanted to ask a question about that spun off of the cactus outro, the short cactus outro, and I'll just sort of read that for people. Cactus roots spread broad, not deep. In this, they mirror a diaspora. I wanted to hear if you wouldn't mind hear you talk a little bit about the relationship between the personal and the more broadly resonant. It's one of those things that as poets, we have to do something, manage, negotiate, or balance, or something in there, staying in the realm of what we know or can imagine or have experienced or whatever. And in disclosing personal things, there probably should be some sort of broader ripple or resonance. Otherwise, it could be just too close. But at the same time, how does one disclose and offer the personal without making it inherently subordinate or just purely metaphorical? So I wondered a little bit if you could talk about the personal nature. I mean, the book even includes like personal photographs or family photographs, it appears, and just sort of disclosure of the personal relative to these sort of broader kind of questions in the book.
Maybe this isn't what every poet does. Maybe this is trite. Maybe this is incorrect. But when I started constructing the story I was trying to tell, I feel like the way I come to poems is through a series of moments. And then those moments I mine for meaning for me. So every poem I write, probably everything I write, is first trying to answer some questions about the world for myself. But in that sense, I don't know if I hope, but what I think might end up happening, or maybe what I try to make happen, is finding meaning in those moments that might be instructive broadly, outwardly. Because I can share a poem about anything with anyone, but if I don't think it has something to offer folks, why am I sharing it? So I try to make sense out of moments in my life, the ones that resonate with me. And like I said, I heard a track. That's how A Modest Proposal was done. The very first poem in the book, Peacocking, that first phrase, "You a boy," right? I heard that phrase come out of a man's mouth to who I assumed was his son. And I saw the look on that boy's face, and like half my life flashed before my eyes. So when I get to that line, I wish I didn't know the rest of this story. It's like part of that's, and when I wrote that poem is about when I started to realize that this book was broader than about my dad. This is a conversation about masculinity. How are we shaping boys in ways that hurt, not only outward, because we think a lot about, and it's fair and it's reasonable and it's just and it needs to continue. We think a lot about how masculinity is corrosive and destructive outwardly. We need to do more ourselves about thinking about how it's corrosive inwardly. I care very specifically within the Black community because I'm Black, and within the queer community because I'm queer. But that conversation. So that's a lot of what I'm hoping will come out of my poems. And when I wrote that, cactus roots spread broad, not deep, that comes from, I was thinking through what diaspora is like. And I was thinking through, having lost, being unable to reach back and know that there's something tangible back there that you belong to, but not being able to claim it, not directly, not be able to create a direct lineage because the links are broken. So so what we can do is tether ourselves here, but we can't go back in time the way people who weren't disrupted can go back in time. So that's kind of what I was thinking about the fact that Black folks have to carry everything right here. And cacti, they are their own water source for sometimes years. So that became a sort of an image that made sense to me when I was thinking about the experiences we go through. I don't even know if that was responsive to your question, Allison. but that's where my mind went.
I'm wondering if we should read Peacocking, if you would.
Sure.
It's a beautiful poem, the opening poem.
Thank you. Yes. You know, I didn't realize it when I wrote it, but did I close my file? I am so sorry, people. It's going to take me 1 second to get to that poem because I evidently evidently accidentally closed it. But
everyone can take a moment to order the book.
There you go. Oh, thank you. Wow, you're good. Thank you. That's so sweet. When I wrote this poem, I had various folks look at it, and I had somebody look at my collection, and what he said is, "This is your thesis statement." And I was like, "Yes." I had never thought of it that way, but when he said it, I was like, "That's true. That is literally true about the book. Peacocking is my thesis statement." And anyway, I told you how it was born. So here we go. Peacocking. You a boy, right? It's this silly game I play with myself, scavenging for scraps of conversation of context, like peacocks in the Arctic, or tenderness expressed in baritone. And here in this department store, like every other, I'd found it, a single word, sharp and swift to Fisher. Boy. Perhaps the boy had stared too long at the man behind the cosmetics counter. Gothic arches penciled in where eyebrows once grew. Perhaps the boy had lingered, longing, lusting, fingered the fabric of some skirt or blouse as the man I can't imagine is his father whisked him through the Mrs. section. This boy, broken, his stride, his spirit. While some woman, I can only imagine the boy called mother, guided her gaze toward anywhere but this moment. She's long seated hope for something soft in the boy. I wish I didn't know the rest of his story, how butterflies won't so much settle in a boy's belly as slit their own throats for fear of flamboyance, how a boy must fashion his fists into ciphers for touch, how quick we are to teach a boy to cradle his hurt in his hands and preen. So that's peacocking. You know, Allison, I haven't asked you to read one of your poems, and the one of your poems, I mean, a lot of them resonated with me, but as I told you earlier, one of the ones that I especially love is RD 8 Box 16A Rural Route, and I think it does a masterful job of sort of containing tenderness and tension in the same poem. You know, that conversation we've been having all night, you know, sort of there's something more than what's obvious in that poem. So I was wondering if you would share that poem, because I think it's an interesting complement to this one. And yeah, we're eating into question and answer time. And then after that, maybe we have to jump right into Q&A. Would you mind sharing it?
I will, as long as we make sure to reserve time for invitation from you by the end.
Okay.
That's my negotiation, but
yeah.
We're
going to get to questions, people, right now. We promise, right after this.
Thank you for asking me to read it. There's always a funny story. I was reading with another poet from Pennsylvania, and the night before I stayed up and quickly wrote a poem because it felt interesting and momentous to me to be reading with another poet from not just Pennsylvania, but central Pennsylvania, which people have learned a lot about this week.
Yeah.
And RD Box 16A was my address in Gettysburg.
Wow.
Because it was too rural for a street address at first. So it was a rural delivery route. That's what they were called. I'll just read it. I miss the ugly things. Sallow flypaper crusting in porch sun, boot lines across shit cake denim. The dog's staff-eaten paw soaking in a Cool Whip bowl. No lemonade sweating on a sill. I want the penny loafer testing a rumble strip of rusty nails, betadine's kidney smear stain. I want the sour ferment of rotting hay and the funk of whatever it is that's died between the walls. I'm ready now, made to scrape grease from the brick hearth, to sweep attic bats, to drown the raccoon. Outside, a kind of rainy season, yew bushes shedding their coal-colored seeds as if to hide all evidence. When you're young, what you don't know can kill you, can flush your lips with berry wine. Tasha's up the road, laying heavy from the bus driver. The boy I won't name aims a rifle at his cousin. There they stand, smiling, breathing hard. Let me keep them here with us. Relax the fingers pulley, coil this film, stack it in a glossy gray tin. Praise the dirt, breeding in a cut. How easy methane drunk air parts for buckshot meteor shower. What ache is this that mimics a wireworm's slim boreholes? I wash a dish, feel nothing but phantom cornstalk, kernels swelling as my hand smothers silk rubs with oil. So much gold everywhere, gold. How did I not see it? Gas lowered, the skillet still spits. The pond, untroubled, swallows any splash. This raccoon's not thrashing. It's just a dance. His eyes yellow glare, nothing more than a reflection of some old rising sun.
Yeah.
So thanks
Thank you.
To read that.
No problem. It resonated with me. And I know a teeny little bit about that section of Pennsylvania because I know some folks from there. And to me, it captured so much that, and you and I were having this conversation earlier, people, for whatever reason, they have their views of these sections of Americana, and I don't think they capture the fullness of them. And that poem to me spoke to me in a way that did. And it seemed particularly apropos at this moment.
This is the week for a Central Pennsylvania poem. Right?
We have a lot of questions here that I wasn't anticipating. Ken Reeves is here. Ken Reeves is one of my dear friends and mentors, former mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard Bookstore sits. And I love that he joined us.
Love from
yes,
Cambridge
right?
And Providence.
I'm going to answer his question first because it's easy, and then several questions asked about rhythm. So I will jump into those next. Ken asked how I came up with the title and the cover, and I talked a little bit about how I came up with the title. Kink is a word that resonates because it has sex connotations and otherness connotations, queerness connotations, literal Black hairness connotations. So it talks about all those multiplicities that force is the wrong word because I don't feel forced. One of the things that I think that 2020, the way 2020 has gone down has made clear is that there are some difficult conversations that folks need to have. Black folks with themselves, white folks with themselves, Black folks with white folks, Latinx and Asian, etc. Blah, blah, blah. And that's not me minimizing, that's me realizing I need to wrap it up. But one of the things that has become clear that it needs to be explicitly said, or that people didn't seem to understand, is Blackness is not a burden to us who are Black. Blackness is a revelatory and celebratory and astounding experience. I don't know how else to describe it. I feel privileged. And I don't know personally millions of people, but I know many people who that statement resonates with. So I wrote a poem called America, and one of the lines in it was, I am original kink. And when I wrote that line, I was like, oh, okay. Because that poem was meant to be a conversation with America. In the Langston Hughes and Allen Ginsberg and so many other folks having written poems, letters to America, that this was mine. So that's kind of where the title came from. The cover specifically is a reference back to a poet that's no longer with us. There was a moment in the late 80s and early 90s where there was a blossoming of Black gay men, poets and writers. And at the same time that we had this wealth of creativity happening, it was snatched away from us because we lost a lot of those folks to HIV and AIDS. So it was this wonderful renaissance, for lack of a better word, that was gone all too soon. And Essex Hemphill was one of the poets at the forefront of that. And he wrote a book called Ceremonies. And on it was a Black man who was unclothed and shaded in the correct parts to not be censored, and a very artistic pose that looked like he was dancing, or in mid-dance, but performance dance. And because that book and that poet and that moment in history meant so much to me, because I was coming out about the time that was happening, I wanted to reference back to that. So that's why, and I didn't know I was going to do that. I just recognized when I found this photo that that's what I was going to do. A lot of people also asked about rhythm in my poems, and I actually have an original kink playlist on Spotify because somebody specifically asked what types of music inspire my poems. But that is sort of a list of the kinds of music that historically have impacted me. It's a little bit jazz. There's some reggae in there because I'm Caribbean. There's a little bit of Spanish-speaking Caribbean music in there also, because I don't divide up the Caribbean by Spanish-speaking and English-speaking automatically. I have a little bit of all of that in my family and a little bit of all that history. And there's a lot of R&B. There might even be a little bit of rap. And also Tina Marie, because I love Tina Marie. So there is that experience. I am a very sound-focused poet. I feel like if I had started a long time ago, I probably would have jumped in the slam scene. I can't write my poems without, you remember that bouncing ball from when we were little? Like, as I reread a poem, I do that a little bit because I need to know the rhythm of each line. So rhythm is very important to me as I write, and I don't have a specific technique for it. It's in here, and I sound it out. But, and I think I said this to you earlier this week, I will literally add or cut words or break a line in a different place if the rhythm is off in my head. Because the rhythm, I go for several things when I write a poem. One of them is surprise and a line break. I live for a line break, and I understand people who don't, but in my mind, it's like, if I get a great line break, I've done my work this year, and I'm just so excited.
Line breaks are the juicy, that's like
right?
The moment.
Exactly, that's like the dessert. It's like, oh my God, look at that line break. I'm so happy with myself, I'm so pleased, probably too pleased. But the other thing I do is I need my poems to have a certain cadence and rhythm, because I see myself as coming from a tradition where that's, even if my grandmother tells me a story, or how she tells me a story, or how my mother tells me a story, there's a cadence in that, there's a rhythm in that. And I literally think of most of my poems as me telling a story, whether it's whichever I poet it is. So I have to hit a cadence that makes sense to the telling of that story, because I visualize who the I is. Like, some of my poems is like an 80-year-old Black woman telling them. And I could tell you which ones, and I don't know if it would make sense to you why those ones are 80-year-old Black women telling them. But in my mind, that's the I of that poem. Absolutely. And sometimes it's an 18-year-old boy, and sometimes it's a 30-year-old man, and sometimes it's the me of now. But that's part of how I developed the rhythm, based on the I that's telling the story, if that makes any sense.
It does. I wonder too if, like, it's almost like listening to instruments interact with each other, the different voices and perspectives all at once. But
yes,
there are some more questions here.
Okay.
We can do one or two more quick ones if that's okay.
Okay.
There is one question that I feel like we should definitely get to, and yeah, someone's asking for a link to the playlist. So
I'm looking for it now.
if you can shoot me that, I can put it on for you. But someone asked about how do you now experience and use the experience of maybe failure, hiccups or failure in your life and writing, in comparison to how you did in your early journey? I feel like this maybe is a young writer question that we should honor.
Mm-hmm. Can you restate it real quick?
Yeah, it was a question about sort of how you channel and use experiences of early failures, I guess, in writing or in life, and channel that into your writing, your early journey, as how it's phrased.
I don't know it's intentional. I think in retrospect, I think age and experience make it more intentional, but also, I don't know when people think back what happens for them, but what one could very broadly define as failure, in my experience, tend to be the formative moments. That moment that crushed you is the moment that you learn something about yourself, whether it's how you deal with disappointment or what's really important to you. Because I've had those moments that of loss that, I didn't even expect to feel. Those tend to be the moments that need to be mined for more meaning. I'm sure there are wonderful moments of great success. I mean, there are some joyous poems in this book, and some of them are based in real experiences in my life. But when I think about the poems that take me to a place of meaning or understanding or figuring something out about myself or the world, like Every God is a slowly dying sun, like I told you, that's a sort of mea culpa poem that it took me 25 years to write. Because I couldn't accept my role, my failure in that situation. It took me years, decades even, to do that. So I use failure because failure is where the meaning lies. Failure is what is the measure of me. Other people might think differently, but I find thinking through how I have dealt with disappointment and loss and rejection and being not the best person I can be, having failed other people, especially that, having failed other people, is what helped this book become what it is, what helps my poetry become what it is.
Well, thank you so much. There's a few more questions. I'm wondering if we should maybe end with a poem. This is such a hard week for everyone. We had talked before about ending possibly with invitation, which gives everyone a place to step forward. What do you think? What would you prefer?
Yes. I'm going to put my website in the box because I want people who have questions to know that there's a contact link there. And if you're really vested in me answering a question that we didn't get to, please just contact me. I'm pretty good about my email. What poem should I end with? What if we end, did I do it again? What if we end on an up note and I read Superhero Origin Story? What do you think? Does that sound good?
Thumbs up. Yeah, thumbs up.
Okay, good. I will tell you right before I read this that this poem is actually the last poem in the book I wrote. This poem was written during the pandemic and it literally happened on Easter Sunday. And it didn't happen as it's written here exactly. And I was going to tell you that story, but A, we're out of time, and B, I don't want to ruin the mystery. So I'm just going to read you this poem. It's called Superhero Origin Story. It's Easter morning, and though I hear I'm as likely to catch hell as be saved if I cross a church threshold, I find myself tripping over 5 young girls, not a one yet 16, belting "Ride On King Jesus." To my mind, the blackest hymn ever played, and oh, my sweet children, if you could just hear how those 4 sopranos and altos, a pair of each, race each other up a sainted ladder of notes and half notes, aiming not to reach the heavens, but by grace to blast open heaven's door, so as for all of us to taste a minute of that great getting up morning. While the 5th sister does the yeoman's work, holding that baseline steady, making sure that ladder don't so much as wobble. And as if on cue, the firmament above me commences to burst and spill forth all over this green and gray earth. And a simpler man might have thought this some rogue omen, some bad juju, but I have seen the song that rain brings. And for a moment, for one infinite instant, I think my own tears are done with down and falling upward like my open palms to meet the rain for a hallelujah. And as I moved myself to twirl, to spin, to wail the words, "Ride on, King Jesus, no man can hinder me," I'm quick corrected by a neighbor. "It's thee, not me." I'm not so sure, friend. I hear that song, that unending crescendo feels like I'm the one who's unbreakable.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you to all of you for coming. I know you could be doing a million things with your Friday night. Thank you for spending it with us. I so appreciate it, Allison. I know you appreciate it.
I absolutely appreciate it. And I'm happy that the last poem at least touched in metaphor on the question about the sacred and the profane, that last question.
Yes. We'll have a whole separate conversation about that at some point. That could be a dissertation.
Well, thank you both. This was, I think, really needed this week. It was really beautiful. So thank you to Jubi and Allison, excuse me. It's been a long week.
Any
thanks to all
updates, Hillary?
Nothing big, no. Not that I was tracking, but no, nothing big. Thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about this book and purchase Original Kink at the link in the chat, or once this shuts down at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, everybody. Keep reading, and really, please be well. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
both.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.